but that was in the warmth of the kitchen. She obviously had different thoughts now she was outside. Bernie had been on dog-walking duty each morning since Zena had arrived on Christmas Eve, and although it was not yet 6 a.m, he felt the exercise was doing him good, even though for now it was just a short loop until the puppy's little legs grew stronger. Most mornings Bernie saw it as an opportunity to prepare himself for the day ahead. It also gave him time to focus on the persistent worry that hardly let go of him for a second. This morning, though, he was thinking about the conversation he'd had with his daughter, Scarlett. Not really a conversation, it was more of an accusation, and he needed to find a way to fix it. "Come on, Zena," he said softly, as he coaxed the little chocolate Labrador along their usual route, following the road down the path behind the church, out into the lane beyond, then back towards home. The circuit took no more than 15 minutes, and he never met anyone when he was out. The early hour and the chilly, damp morning saw to that. He turned left onto the path and looked up at the church tower, standing starkly against the dark blue of a sky that wasn't going to lighten any time soon. He looked down at his feet, trying to avoid the worst of the puddles, which Zena, now accustomed to the cold, happily trotted through, her brand-new collar with its blue LEDs reflecting off the black water. He was going to have to decide what to tell Scarlett, how to answer her questions. Not with the whole truth, obviously, but he was sure he could think of an explanation that she might accept, some watered-down version of the truth that a 13-year-old might understand. When he'd seen her face that morning and heard the disgust in her voice, his guts had knotted. He couldn't lose Scarlett. He knew he was out of options. He had to put this right and accept the consequences. Bernie turned onto the narrow lane that ran back towards home. The dry stone walls on either side of the single track created a wind tunnel, and he bent forward slightly to keep the worst of the drizzle off his face. He looked down at Zena and smiled at the sight of her. With her wet fur, she looked like a drowned rat. As he watched, she lifted her head and her ears went up. Zena stopped. "Come on, Zena," Bernie said, raising his voice slightly against the wind. "Get a move on." What had she heard? Her head was cocked slightly to one side, but it wasn't until a pale glow relieved the darkness surrounding him that he realised there was a car on the lane ahead, approaching slowly, its dimmed headlamps creating gleaming pools of warm yellow light on the lane. Bernie lifted his head and held his hand out, asking the driver to stop. There was no grass verge to move to so the car could pass, no farm gate to slip through. The car drew to a halt about 10 metres ahead. Bernie nodded his thanks, hoping the driver could see the small amount of his face that was peering out from beneath the hood of his green jacket. He picked Zena up so they could squeeze through the narrow gap between the car and the wall. As he grasped her wriggling body, he heard a sound he wasn't expecting. The driver was revving his engine, probably indicating that Bernie should hurry up. Holding Zena close to his chest, he started to move towards the car, but not as quickly as the car moved towards him, its headlamps now on full beam, blinding him. There was nowhere to go. Bernie's last thought before the car hit him and Zena was that now he would never get the chance to put things right with his daughter. Chapter 1. 18 months later. The sound of a door closing upstairs should have given Natalie Gray sufficient warning that she wasn't going to be alone for much longer. But her eyes were locked onto the computer screen, and her heart was pounding. "Oh, God," she whispered, as she stared at the images in front of her. "Please tell me this is work-related." Her words were barely audible, but finally Ed's cheerful whistling penetrated her consciousness as it grew ever closer, and she quickly and silently closed the lid of his laptop and hurried across to the kettle, snatching it off its base and thrusting it under the cold tap, as if she'd been standing by the sink all the time. She shouldn't have been looking at Ed's computer, but she'd wanted to check the weather for the day. She'd gone to his browser history to see if the forecast site was there, and it probably was, but she hadn't made it that far. "Do you want a cup of tea, Ed?" she asked, trying for bright and cheerful. Her voice sounded brittle to her own ears.